Hi guys. Thank you for having me again. I'm glad to be here with you guys. I'm very happy that you guys give time off to Pastor Chang's family to take a time off. It is very important for pastors to rest so that they may be re-energized to come back and serve you guys well again. Pastor Jeff has told me a lot of great stories. He says, he told me recently when I talked to him over the phone, he's like, over the years, I'm just getting more and more proud of my congregation that I've been serving, that they're growing and maturing and whatnot, and I've been hearing very good report about you guys, so that's very good to hear. And thank you for having me. I've been to this church maybe like 2-3 other times, once at a retreat and once at like young adult meeting. I forget what it was, but I talked about occupation and doing it for the glory of God. So today I get to preach to you guys from Galatians 1:6-10, which our brother has read for us. Today's sermon title is called Being Faithful to the Gospel. Today's sermon title is called Being Faithful to the Gospel. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. When I was, pastor, I feel like I share a lot about my life because that's where I draw a lot of illustrations from. So this is one of the kind of embarrassing story that I have from when I was younger. And do we have any little ones here too, or what's the youngest age in this group? Huh? High school? Junior high? Junior high. Okay, cool. Maybe junior high or maybe high school kids could relate because this happened to me in high school. So when I was in high school, there's a girl that I was interested in and we were dating for a little bit. And in high school, it wasn't really like a serious relationship, but it was like, oh, I like you. And then, we were back in the days when I was younger, we had this thing called AOL. It's called American Online. It was actually one of the internet systems. I know, some of the parents are like, oh my gosh, that's so old. I know, yes. And there was 56K modem or 24.4K modem where you log in and it makes a weird modem connecting noise. And then you got connected to AOL. And in there, one of the things that a lot of the high school kids did was that they try to find opposite gender to get to know and befriend and whatnot, These days you have apps for that, but back in the day there was no app. So, you go to a chat room and you meet people and then whatnot, and then there's a girl that I was kind of getting interested in getting to know, and we were talking for a while. And then I lived in northern Jersey, and she lived a little bit south, and one day, we were talking a lot, and I was like, hey, I have to go meet her. And then before I went to go meet her, we're literally talking through the morning. We're on the phone, and we were talking through the morning. I was talking to her till I don't know, 5, 6 a.m., and I went to school getting 1 hour of sleep. Very bad, I know. Sorry. I did that, and then that one day I decided to go meet her. We met, and I was talking to her, and we had fun, and then again, we were just talking through 3, 4 a.m., and then I decided, I got to go home because I'm going to get in trouble because this is late and I've been out too long. And I was on my way home, and then I remember in high school, one of the teachers, I think probably a science teacher, told us something like this. He said, when you're tired, if you turn on a heat, it will make you more drowsy, but if you turn on a cold AC, it will kind of keep you more up. And I kind of forgot about that, and I was like, what was it again? Was it heat or cold? And I'm driving at 4 or 5 a.m. I drank 2-3 cups of coffee, hoping that I would stay awake, and I'm driving and I forgot. I was like, what was it? Heat or cold? Heat or cold? Heat or cold? I'm driving on the highway on 95, and then I decided to turn on heat since it was already kind of cold. I'm like, I gotta turn on heat, I gotta drive. And then I turned on the heat full, thinking that it's gonna keep me up, and I had some coffee, and then little did I know, about 15 minutes in, I fell asleep. And then I got into a car accident on 95. I didn't hit anyone, I didn't kill anyone. I was dumb for driving while feeling like I was so tired. I got into a highway accident in 95. I hit the metal rail in the middle, and then the good thing that happened to me was that when I hit the metal rail, there was a huge grass from the metal rail to where the highway was still running. It was that short period where it had that. And because of that, I didn't die and I didn't hit anyone. No one hit me from the back. And I woke up, just waking up to the sound of all the accidents and, body moving and whatnot. And I totaled my dad's car. My dad had Nissan Maxima at that time. I totaled it, and it was garbage because of that. just because I couldn't remember this one information, well, maybe not just one, but just because, a lot of my stupid choices, verse plus, one thing I forgot that it was cold or AC, like the heat really messed me up because, heat really makes you more drowsy. And because of that, that really cost me almost my life and my dad's car. And I could have killed someone else too in my midst of being stupid. And in the same way, what today's passage is saying is that same thing. In Galatian church, what Apostle Paul is saying is, if you don't listen to the first gospel that we taught you, it's going to have dire consequences for your life. Just like I forgot what my teacher taught me, it was the AC that keeps you up, not the heat, because he's going to have totally opposite effect. And what Apostle Paul is saying to Galatian church is this. He's saying, remember what we taught you. Stop listening to what other people are teaching you, this false teacher are teaching you, because it's going to have a dire consequences in your life. If you listen to them, what's going to happen is that your life will be a curse. And then he says, hold fast to the teachings that I've given you. And why was Apostle Paul saying this? Because in the church of Galatia, there were some false teachers that came from people in Jerusalem. This people who were Jewish Christian at that time, they came to Galatia and were teaching false things. They were saying, not just faith that gets you saved, you also have to be circumcised. So all of you get circumcised if you want to be saved, and that was contrary to the truth of the gospel because you're not saved by work, you're saved by faith. And this is what they were teaching them. And then, and in that time, you have to understand because Jesus just died like 33 AD or whatnot, and this probably happened in 30, 40 years later. So they're kind of still trying to figure out the theology. Like they don't have the whole Bible with them. We have the New Testament and the Old Testament, and we kind of have everything. But you know how Jesus tried to, how God tried to, in His sovereignty, you know how He tried to complete the Bible? There are so many problems in the church. We would not know what the gospel was and all the details of the gospel unless there was a Galatians, unless there was a problem in Ephesians, unless there's a problem in Acts, unless there's a problem here and there. And all these problems at that time, they might be like, man, God, why is it so hard being Christian? Well, one of the things is I want Paul to write this letter so that people 1,000 years from then would read and understand what the gospel is. And this is what God had to do. And in that church, there was this false understanding, and because of that, people were deserting the truth. People were no longer holding on to what Apostle Paul has said, and they're listening to all these false teachers that came about. It's similar to the way that I went to school in ATS, Alliance Theological Seminary. It was very interesting because in that school, people came from all different kind of social, economical, places. And even though there weren't liberal Christianity, so liberal Christianity is different from political liberalness. Liberal Christianity, when we say liberal, we're probably talking more about how Jesus isn't the only way, or Jesus isn't God, every religion is okay. That's what I'm talking about. So, we didn't have that at school, but we were pretty wide in spectrum concerning Christianity, but they were all conservatively Christian belief stuff. But what's interesting is, I'm sure in Pastor Jeff's church, maybe Jeff has talked about predestination, right? So interestingly, these students would sit with one professor and go, and then one professor is giving argument for free will. You have free will to believe in the Lord, and then these same students were so convinced that free will is how God saves people. And they're like, yes, that professor, what he's saying is so true. And then secondly, the next day or a week after or a month later, another professor gives a presentation about predestination. And he was very convincing. And then the same student that was like, yeah, free will, are now clapping again. Wow. Predestination is the way. That's how God saves people. And when I saw that, I realized people did not have discernment. People did not have grounding in truth. And I think it's the same idea of the people in Galatia. When they first heard the gospel from Paul, they're like, wow, that is the gospel, that's the truth. And then later on, when false teacher came in, they're like, you must be circumcised. And they probably gave very convincing logic. They're like, yes, that must be true too. And in their head, they don't
quite get that there's a contradiction there. Free will and predestination cannot both be true. Salvation by work and salvation by faith cannot both be true. And they lack discernment, they lack the truth. They did not ground themselves in truth. And in the same way, some of us are influenced by our media, right? Like we look at media and the media says one thing, and a lot of us go, wow, that shouldn't happen. Yay. Very true. Very good. And we hold on to them and we go, yes, to the world. And then the week after, you hear a pastor preach, and pastor's giving a very convincing logic to it, and you go, yes, pastor's true. And yet, what the media might have said and what the pastor might have said might be totally opposite from each other. We're so swayed by an argument that sounds good in the moment. We don't know what the truth is. And this is what was happening to the Galatian church. And then why is it bad to desert the truth? Why is it bad to not know the gospel, right? So Paul is writing this. The whole premise of Galatians is this. You are believing in the false gospel, and here's why it's bad. And in the beginning, he says in verse 7 and 8, and he says this twice, but even if we or angels or heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone is preaching to you to the gospel contrary to the one you receive, let him be accursed. Apostle Paul makes the same point in verse 8 and verse 9. He says it twice because for him this is such a serious matter. Believe in the gospel. Believe what we already taught you. Do not listen to false teachers. Apostle Paul was saying when you are leaving the gospel that you first heard, when you've forsaken it, you no longer have the power of the gospel to save you from sin. And here, you hear this word, that if you abandon the gospel, you're accursed. If you leave the gospel, you're accursed. And you're like, wow, that sounds really harsh. I don't think it's like really harsh or hard to understand. What Paul is saying is, when you no longer believe in the gospel, you are no longer in God's grace. God can't save you anymore because you don't believe that God died for your sin. Isn't it interesting that Paul uses the word accursed here? Because, the whole Old Testament is like foreshadowing of Jesus. Like everything that happens is like foreshadowing of Jesus. Isn't it interesting? Like, for example, like a small side note, like, like Passover, like, I have a lot of Jewish coworkers I also work outside of church. At my work, I work at Chase, and there's a lot of Jewish coworkers or a few Jewish coworkers. And they were celebrating Passover a few months ago, and I was like, the Passover, like, it signifies Jesus. Like when the lamb was killed and then was put on the door on the top and the side, like the blood, and then when the angel sees the blood, they pass over and no longer brings death to that family. That's actually that's symbolic to Jesus. And there's so many, like, because Jesus died on the cross, there's blood shedding, and if he died for your sin, you no longer have to die for your sin. You no longer need to receive the punishment, and the judgment passes over you. The whole Old Testament points to Jesus. And what's one of the interesting things is, concerning a curse, there's a verse in the Old Testament that gets shown over and over again. Anyone who hangs on a tree is a curse from God. Anyone hangs on a tree is a curse from God. And here, Paul uses the word curse because Jesus, when he died on the cross, he was hanging on a tree. And he was a curse for us. And what Paul is saying, if you no longer believe the true gospel, that Jesus died in your place to be cursed from God so that you may no longer be cursed from God, if you don't believe that, he can't forgive you because you no longer believe that Jesus died on the cross for your sin. When you don't believe the true gospel, the natural consequences is that the gospel's power is no longer being worked in your life. And this is what Apostle Paul is saying. You will be accursed when you no longer believe in the gospel. So what do? If you don't want to be accursed, what Apostle Paul teaches us in verse 10 is this. And if you don't want to be accursed, do not seek the approval of man, but seek the approval of God. And it comes from verse 10. And verse 10 says this, for am I now seeking approval of man or of God? Am I trying to please man? If I were trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ. Apostle Paul is making a case here, and why he's trustworthy. So like in chapter 2 in Galatians, Apostle Paul talks about his life, how he's accepted by, the Jerusalem council, that they call him apostle, that he spent years persecuting the Christian, but yet his life has turned around. He's kind of building up his resume to tell them why the gospel that Apostle Paul taught to the Galatians is the true gospel, and then these foreigners that just came out of nowhere is teaching the false gospel. They're not true. And one of the signs that Apostle Paul is saying is, do you know why they're not a real, true servant of God? It's because they're not fearing God, they're fearing men. They want approval of men, they don't want approval of God. And this is what Paul's saying. And in the same way, even in today's church, there's a lot of false teachers in the church. One of the false teachers I would say is Rob Bell. He wrote a book called, I think, Love Wins. Doesn't that sound beautiful, Love Wins? It does, right? Like, who doesn't want love to win? But yet, in it, he talks about how there is no hell. There is no punishment of sin. And my question is, if there is no hell, there was no need for Christ to die at all. If there is no punishment of sin, why did Jesus even have to die? The mere thought of hell not being in existence is a denial of the gospel. And yet, Rob Bell, who was once a very famous preacher, this is what he says, and he even wrote a book about it. He wanted to please men. He wanted people to like him. He didn't want to offend anyone. He wanted to go to church and people would like him as a leader. He didn't want to say anything harsh. But who is a better doctor if you have cancer? Is a better doctor the one who says, you're not sick, you don't have cancer, you're good, live your life to the fullest? And in his head, maybe he's thinking, you only have about a year or two, so maybe you should live your life to the fullest. Is that the best doctor, or is the best doctor someone who comes and tells you the truth? Hey, it seems like you have cancer, you might have to do a surgery. I want you to make sure that you have your life in order just in case you might die. Who is a better physician? Is the one that's trying to earn your approval? Is the one who might be telling you the truth and might hurt you in the way, but wants you to know the truth? When you're a little kid, I used to preach to youth kids back in the days, and there was this little girl who loved candy. She would eat candy as breakfast, lunch, and dinner. She would just eat candy. I'm like, you're crazy. And I would go to her and be like, if you keep eating candies like that, one day you might get diabetes, and you're going to have rotten teeth, and you're going to lose your teeth. And at that point, she hated me. She's like, I hate you, Pastor Jay. Don't tell me those things. And, if I wanted to be liked by her, she didn't like me because I told her the truth. When she was being bratty, I'd be like, you can't do that. You got to be a better girl. You can't live your life like a little kid as you're getting older. And she would hate me for it. But in my head, I'm like, if there's two type of parents who's telling the kid what they need to do. When parents are going, eat your broccoli, they're not doing it out of love. They're not doing it out of hate, sorry. They're not doing it out of hate, sorry. They're doing it out of love. They are doing it out of love. You know what I mean? It's like, who is really trying to love the person? Is the person who is trying to tell you what you want to hear, the good friend? Or is a friend, who is being a better parent? Who is being a better friend? Like, if my friend is having alcoholic problem, who's a better friend? The one that says, hey, let's go drinking together, or the one that says, I think you have a problem, I love you, and I'm going to work it out with you, and we're going to have intervention for you. Maybe, I might not be liked by my friend when I say that, but I hope I'm being a better friend. I hope that is a true love versus a false love pretense where I make you feel better, but inside I know that your life is not going to be well. And this is what Apostle Paul is saying. Some leaders seek approval of men, and some wants to please God. John Wesley was a Methodist pastor, and what's interesting about him, you read his diary, and they had this Great Awakening movement, and they were so cool because these revivalists, what they did was they would be on a horse, traveling from town to town. They're literally traveling few days in horses or whatever, and they're praying. They're praying, God, bring revival to the city that I'm going to. Today I'm coming to Staten Island, and I'm like, God, I pray that the Staten Island church will really listen to your word and be transformed, and that what I have to bring will really impact their life. I'm doing that. And this is what John Wesley did. Every day, they're preaching literally 5 times a week. They're like going from one city to another, and they had a huge revival. And these pastors, they committed themselves to fasting like, I think like twice a week or once a week. Like all the pastors were in Methodist, they're supposed to fast. There were this zealful people who wanted to please God. But you know what's so interesting about John Wesley's first years of ministry? He would preach to people, and he preached a very simple message. He said, we're all sinners in the eyes of God, and we need forgiveness from God. And if you haven't really experienced the forgiveness, if you haven't really known the forgiveness of God, maybe you're not saved and you're destined to hell, and I don't want you to go to hell. I want you to go to heaven. And John Wesley would preach this over and over again. And one church, when he, it's such a simple message, but he prays so much that at one church there's like revival. People are getting saved. People are like, I want to turn my life to Jesus. And in another church, he's literally getting kicked out. He's like, don't ever come back. Don't come back to our church because we don't want your message here. We don't want to listen to you. And it's kind of like, but for John, he held it through. He prayed, and he said, God, even if people don't like me, even if people are not pleased with me, I am still going to do the work of the Lord. I'm still going to please you. I'm still going to preach the truth because I don't want anyone to perish. And with that heart, he kept praying. He kept going after it, and he had and then like God used him to be part of a great awakening. There was a huge wave of people being saved. Do we seek approval of man, or do we seek approval of God? This is what Paul's saying. This is how you know they're false teachers, because they want approval of man, not the approval of God. Even the current Pope, he's a very nice guy, but he's a universalist, if we're honest. He believes everyone goes to heaven. Like one kid, it was very like emotional and sad. Like one of the kids said, my dad just died and he was atheist. He was never a Christian. Is he going to hell? And he didn't have a heart to tell him no. And who in that, I wouldn't tell the kid that your dad's going to hell for being atheist in that moment. He probably needs counseling, love, and consolation, and a lot of love at that point. And the truth of the matter is, no one knows where. That's not even enough story to know where they're going either. Because who knows where they were at the end of their life or whatnot, or earlier in their life? I don't know. But universalism, sometimes I think Pope wanted to make him feel better, and he said, "Of course your dad's in heaven." Well, but then I think for me, like when I heard that, it's kind of like when you say that your dad is in heaven, and it's hard for you to say someone's father could be in hell. Well, with that logic, then no one should be in hell. Because everyone is someone's son, everyone is someone's daughter, everyone is someone's father, everyone is someone's mother, everyone is someone's grandma, everyone is someone's grandpa. In that logic, of course it's sad to see any family member go to hell. But do you hold on to the truth and say that there is heaven and hell? Or do you just say, oh, there's no hell. Jesus died for no reason. Because when you start to go that route, there was no reason for Jesus to have died. And I think, why is this so important for us in our age? Back in the days, following Christ meant that your life might get killed. Nero literally put a stake on Christians' body and burned them life to death. And he held parties for his governors, and there were like human torches. There were Christians that were like dying, and this is how Nero threw a party for himself. Back in the days, being follower of Christ meant your family might disown you, and you might not even have a job anymore because you're ostracized by your family and your community, because community is a big community life. And even in the Middle East today, if you follow Christ, the whole community comes after you. You no longer have jobs, your family disowns you, and your family, they have to disown them unless, they are unfaithful too now. And following Christ had a lot of price back in the days. Following Christ cost something. The grace of God was free, but the cost of God's forgiveness was not cheap. Even the forgiveness of Christ is free, the cost of forgiveness was not cheap. I have a little one. I think some of you guys saw my cute little son. I can't imagine, sacrificing. I even thought about it in the midst of my sermon. I was like, I be able to like sacrifice my own son for like these people here? Sorry. Like I wouldn't, like if my son dying means all of you guys get, I don't know, maybe, I don't know. Like there's like, I don't know. But God the Father loved his son and he gave up his one and only son. You know, like when you read John 3:16, we're so used to it, but there's such love and care. You know, for God so loved the world, like he loved the world, that he gave one and only son. There's like something precious in that word, one and only. Like this is his all. This is his best treasure. This is his one and only son. This is his pride and joy. This is like his most treasured gift. And he was willing to crush it for the sake of the world. And even though forgiveness of God is freely given to everyone, the cost of forgiveness was not cheap. Just because you might have received an heirloom from your family, you receive it for free, the cost of the heirloom might not be free. You know, it's very costly. But yet, when we understand the cost of Christ, when we understand the cost of God the Father, we start to appreciate and start to hold fast to the gospel, and then we start to deny other things. Like these people, when they believe in Jesus, they're like, rejection by my family is worth it if it means I could be with God the Father. Rejection by family is worth it, and my community is worth it. It means I get to be part of God's kingdom. Like they had this resolve to believe in the gospel, even though there's all these accusations and hardship. In today's day, believing in Jesus doesn't have the same weightiness. There is no persecution, but there's a little bit of hatred. There's a little bit of, we're not persecuted, but we're kind of, like being Christian means like you're bigoted. Being Christian means you're not thinking correctly. Being Christian means, and in the midst of people saying that, what we do is this, we're like, no, we want to be liked by you. Whatever you believe in, we're going to say yes and amen to everything that you believe in. And what the world says, even John 2:14, it says, do not love the world or anything in the world. Anyone who loves the world more than me does not have the love of the Father inside of them. There's over and over, in Romans 12, it says, Romans 1 through 11 is all about the gospel, and then 12 through 16 is all about how to live your Christian life. And the first thing Paul says is, renew your mind. Change your mind, because when you were not of Christ, you were of a sinful nature, and your mind was tainted by a sinful nature. Now that you know the truth, now that you know the gospel, renew your mind and be transformed in your mind and live differently and think differently. You don't agree with everything that the world throws at you. You don't agree with everything that the world says is true or not true. You agree with what only God says is true. And when you start to fall in love with him, you start to understand every man's truth is an opinion unless it comes from God. Just think about it. There was a great period of U.S. life where we thought slavery was okay. Even from the church, we said slavery was okay. There's few in the church that said slavery was not okay. The majority of the church in that time, slavery was dominant in the field, and they were fearing the people, and they didn't have the truth in them, and the church went along with whatever the world is saying. But like the world and the U.S. at that time had slavery, especially in the South. Slavery fueled the economy. They would not have any kind of economical power without the slavery in that time. And the church, instead of standing up for the truth, and few did, and even in UK, William Wilberforce, who was a abolitionist, he was a Christian pastor and a politician. Few did, but yet in the midst of it, there are a lot of church that was saying and repeating exactly what the culture was saying. Culture stance changes. Culture stance changes all the time, because man's moral are just opinion at the end of the day. You and I are called to hold on to a higher moral, hold on to the truth that God says what it is. If God says A, everyone else is a liar. If God says B, everyone else is a liar. And you start to understand God, and you start to think from God's perspective and you start to renew your mind, and what the world says, you say no and you start to believe in God, because the world is trying to reject you. And so many of us wants to be accepted by the world that we want to start saying the same thing the world says. And that's not what God wants for us. We're going to go into a time of prayer, if we could have the music. And, the problem with following the world is this, that eventually when you follow the world and what the world has to say, we start to lose the sight of the gospel. When we try to please, it's one thing to evangelize, but it's another thing to say, everything's okay. Like what you say, I agree with. That's not what the church says. And what we need to do is we need to stand fast. We need to hold fast to God's word. And we need to say, God, let your words be true and every other man's word be a liar. Every other man's opinion is an opinion at the end of the day unless it comes from God's truth. So let's pray. And in this time, can we ask for discernment? Can we ask God, can you rid myself of trying to be man-pleaser, trying to be a people-pleaser, but Lord, help us to be faithful to your word. Help us to hold fast to the gospel. Lord, there's so many wrong teachings that are coming our way. There's wrong things being taught in different churches. There's wrong things being taught from the media. Lord, we live in such a confused age. But Lord, would you renew our mind? Lord, renew our mind, as you said in Romans 12:1. Lord, that we would renew our mind to say that you for the truth. That what you say is what matters. God, would you help us to really hold fast and see the beauty of Christ? Lord, that we will fall so much in love with you that we would not love the world more. Lord, may we always have compassionate heart towards the world and love the world without compromise in our belief. That we would love and reach out and show them the better way. But Lord, we would not compromise in our way of doing that. But Lord, would you really renew our mind? Would you help us to hold fast to your truth? Would you help us to understand what's right and wrong? Help us not to be swayed left and right by every moment and every sound argument. But Lord, help us to know what your word says and hold that as the central of the truth in our hearts. So Father, would you give us discernment? Would you give us the truth? Would you give us a will to hold fast